He called the police himself. What they found shocked everyone. Before we begin, if dark truths, real crimes, and stories that don't let go are your thing, hit subscribe, tap like, and stay close, because this one only gets worse. At 5:27 a.m., the neighborhood was still asleep. The streetlights cast long, pale shadows across perfectly trimmed lawns, and the quiet felt almost staged, too neat, too calm, like a postcard version of safety. Inside one of those houses, a man stood barefoot on cold tile, phone pressed to his ear, his voice steady as he spoke words that would soon echo across the country. "My wife and kids are gone." He said it plainly. No panic. No cracks. Just concern. Measured, controlled, polite. He told the dispatcher that his pregnant wife hadn't answered his calls. That his 2 young daughters were nowhere to be found. That her car was still in the driveway. That something wasn't right. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights broke the quiet. Patrol cars rolled in first, then neighbors, curious, worried, stepping outside in pajamas and robes. The man greeted officers at the door like a host welcoming guests. He answered questions, offered details, walked them through the house. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The beds were made. The kids' blankets neatly folded. Shoes lined up by the door. No broken windows. No signs of a struggle. Not a single drawer pulled open in panic. It was the kind of house people dreamed of building a life in. Photos on the walls, kids' drawings on the fridge, a baby on the way. The man paced slowly as officers checked rooms. He ran his hands through his hair, sighed at the right moments, repeated the same sentence over and over, "I just want them back." When a neighbor arrived, one who had seen the family the night before, he leaned in, listened closely. Surveillance footage was pulled from a nearby camera. It showed the man's truck that morning, parked at an unusual angle. It showed him loading something into the back. Not rushing. Not frantic. Careful. When the footage ended, the room went quiet. The man laughed nervously. "That's me heading to work," he said. "Same as always." Investigators nodded, but something shifted. It wasn't just the footage. It was the tone. The way he watched their reactions. The way he spoke about his missing family in past tense, then corrected himself too quickly. By the afternoon, the story was already on the news. He stood in front of cameras, arms crossed tight against his chest, eyes wide and unblinking. He begged for their return. Said he loved them. Said he couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. That the house felt empty without their laughter. But the words didn't match the man standing there. Detectives noticed it immediately. No tears. No shaking hands. No rawness. Just a performance that felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced grief in the mirror but never learned the rhythm. As the hours passed, small things began to surface. A phone left behind. A purse untouched. Medication still sitting on the counter. A friend mentioned an argument. Another mentioned tension. Financial stress. Messages that stopped abruptly the night before. And then there was the timeline. The man said his wife had left with the children early that morning. But no neighbor saw them. No camera caught them. No credit card was used. No phone pinged a tower. It was as if 3 people had vanished into thin air, without bags, without warning, without a trace. Detectives returned to the house that evening. They asked him to walk them through the last night again. Slowly. Carefully. He did, but this time his story shifted. Just slightly. The kind of shift most people wouldn't notice. A door closed instead of left open. A conversation moved from the kitchen to the bedroom. A time that no longer lined up. One detective wrote a single word in his notebook: control. The man wanted to control the narrative. Control the image. Control what came next. Late that night, investigators received a call from his workplace. An oil site miles away. Remote. Isolated. A place with locked gates and restricted access. The man had been there that morning. Alone. When detectives looked at each other, no one spoke, but they all understood the same thing. If the family hadn't left the house, then they had never made it far. And when authorities prepared to search the site where the man had spent his morning, one question hung heavy in the air, thick, unavoidable, terrifying. What if he didn't call the police for help, but to buy time? Because when they finally arrived at his worksite and began to search the area he knew better than anyone else, they realized the truth wasn't just dark, it was buried. The worksite sat miles from the nearest neighborhood, surrounded by open land and silence that felt unnatural. Steel tanks rose from the ground like monuments, humming faintly in the early morning heat. The air smelled of oil and dust. It was the kind of place where sounds carried too far, and secrets could disappear without witnesses. Detectives arrived just after sunrise. They moved carefully, deliberately, following a checklist that had already been rewritten in their minds a dozen times. This wasn't a routine search anymore. This was a place chosen nuts. A place the man knew intimately. A place where no one would ask questions if he was alone. As they walked the perimeter, one investigator noticed something small but unsettling: fresh tire marks where they shouldn't be. Another pointed out disturbed gravel near one of the tanks, footprints partially erased, as if someone had realized too late they left them behind. Back at the station, the man sat in an interview room, hands folded neatly on the table. He'd agreed to come involuntarily. He always did. Cooperative. Almost eager. He smiled when detectives entered. They asked him again about the night before his family disappeared. Again about the morning. Again about his drive to work. And again the answers came, but they weren't the same answers. Tiny changes. A pause here. A correction there. He spoke faster now, as if trying to stay ahead of the questions. When asked about his relationship with his wife, he hesitated. Just long enough. We had normal problems, he said. Every couple does. The detectives exchanged a glance. Phone records told a different story. Messages between the couple had grown colder. Sharper. There were arguments about money. About trust. About something he didn't want to say out loud. And then there was another name. A name that didn't belong in a marriage. When detectives asked him about it, his face tightened. His jaw clenched. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and sighed as if they were inconveniencing him. It's not relevant, he said. It was the most relevant thing they'd heard all day. Back at the worksite, the search intensified. Officers fanned out, checking every structure, every patch of disturbed earth. The sun climbed higher, heat pressing down, sweat soaking through uniforms. Then someone stopped walking. Near one of the massive oil tanks, the ground looked wrong. Subtly wrong. The soil was darker. Recently moved. Not enough to draw attention from a distance, but impossible to ignore once you saw it. They began to dig. Every shovelful felt heavier than the last. The silence grew thick, broken only by metal striking dirt. Minutes passed. Then one investigator froze. He'd found something. It wasn't large. It wasn't dramatic. Just a piece of fabric. Right? Out of place in the dirt and machinery. Something that clearly did not belong to an oil field. The search halted. Supervisors were called. The area was secured. No one spoke what they were thinking, but it was written on every face. This wasn't about finding a missing family anymore. This was about understanding how far someone would go to erase them. Back in the interview room, the tone shifted. Detectives placed photos on the table, not of what had been found, but of what couldn't be ignored anymore. His truck. The surveillance footage. The timeline contradictions. The messages. The name. The man stared at the table. For the first time since the call to police, he stopped talking. Minutes passed. The silence pressed in. His breathing changed. Shallow. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said. The words landed like a gunshot. Detectives leaned forward. He began to talk, but not about everything. Not yet. He framed it as an argument. A moment that spiraled. A loss of control. He said things happened too fast. That he panicked. That he thought he could fix it. He never said the word murder. Outside, investigators received confirmation from the worksite. They had found more. Enough to know the worst fears were justified. Enough to know that the story the man had told the world, the pleading husband, the desperate father, was a lie built on calculation and silence. As detectives prepared to confront him with what had been discovered, one chilling realization settled over the room. He hadn't called the police because he didn't know where his family was. He called them because he believed, truly believed, that what he'd done would never be uncovered. And as the door to the interrogation room opened again, carrying the weight of evidence he could no longer escape, one question remained unanswered. How does a man erase the people closest to him and still believe he's the victim? Because what he would confess next wouldn't just explain what happened, it would reveal a level of betrayal no one was prepared to hear. The room felt smaller now. The same walls. The same table. But the air had changed, heavy, suffocating, as if the truth itself had weight. The man sat hunched forward, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on a spot that didn't exist. Whatever confidence he once carried had collapsed inward, folding under the pressure of what investigators already knew. They laid it out slowly. What was found at the worksite. Where it was found. What it meant. His breathing became uneven. His fingers twitched. For a moment, it looked like he might stand up, shout, deny everything. Instead, he nodded. Then again. And finally he spoke. He said the argument started late at night. Said voices were raised. Accusations hurled like weapons. He claimed he felt cornered, trapped between the life he had and the life he wanted. He talked about pressure, about fear, about losing control. But the details betrayed him. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't panic. It was planning. He described the house in the early hours of the morning. The silence. The stillness. How he moved through rooms he knew by heart. How he carried out actions with terrifying calm. How his children, trusting, half asleep, followed him without resistance. Detectives didn't interrupt. They didn't need to. He explained how he drove to the worksite before sunrise, knowing exactly where cameras wouldn't reach. How he chose that location because it was familiar. Because it felt safe. Because it belonged to him. And then came the words that would haunt everyone who heard them. He said he believed once it was done, once the bodies were hidden, once the story was told, life would reset. That he could start over. That the world would see him as a victim of tragedy, not the cause of it. He was wrong. When the full scope of the crime was revealed, it sent shockwaves far beyond that quiet neighborhood. Beyond the town. Beyond the state. People who had watched his interview, the calm voice, the steady gaze, felt sick realizing they had been looking at a man asking for sympathy while standing on top of unspeakable acts. The images from the worksite told the real story. The places he chose were not accidental. They were deliberate, final, designed to erase, not just end, the lives of those who depended on him most. In court, there were no dramatic outbursts. No screaming. No last-minute reversals. He sat still as the charges were read, eyes hollow, jaw clenched, as if he were listening to someone else's fate being decided. When sentencing came, there was no escape. Multiple life sentences. No parole. No second chance. No reset. Just a future measured in days behind concrete walls. But even justice couldn't answer the question people kept asking. How does someone wake up next to their family and decide they are obstacles? Friends replayed memories, searching for warning signs. Neighbors questioned every smile, every wave, every polite conversation across the fence. Investigators revisited footage again and again, studying his posture, his tone, his words, looking for the moment the mask slipped. What terrified them most wasn't the violence. It was the normalcy. The fact that the call to police wasn't frantic, but calculated. That the plea for help was a performance. That the crime didn't begin with rage, but with a decision. Years later, the house would be sold. The worksite would continue operating. The news cycle would move on. But the story didn't fade. Because it left behind a warning carved into reality itself. Sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the one hiding in the shadows. It's the one standing in the open, asking for your help, looking you in the eye, and believing they've already won. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you uncomfortable in a way you can't quite shake, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe, because some crimes don't end when the truth comes out.